So here's the plan for tonight. We're going to start by defining omniscience and understanding what it is to be omniscient. We're then going to look at a lot of definitions, and within those definitions, we're going to weave in an understanding of what foreknowledge is and why people have held that foreknowledge. I know that seems like a lot of definitions from the beginning, but don't worry, we're going to play a game, and so hopefully that'll help you stay engaged throughout that part of the talk. From then on, we're going to look at a whole bunch of solutions to the problem of foreknowledge and human freedom. You should get a nice, well-rounded understanding. So, what is omniscience? Well, simply put, being omniscient means that you know all true propositions which are logically possible to know, and you believe no false propositions. That is the definition of omniscience. So, ready for our game? I want you to raise your hand if you think that most theistic philosophers accept whether or not God knows the following proposition. So let's start with this one. Raise your hand. Do you think that most theistic philosophers think God knows this statement? Excellent. Next proposition. What about this statement? Raise your hand, yes or no? Yep. Excellent. This statement, I will fall asleep at 2 a.m. tonight. How many of you think most theistic philosophers agree with that?
If it's true. Wait, is this you or God?
The theistic philosophers. So just, what do most theistic philosophers think?
No, who's the I?
God.
I, me, myself.
Katie.
Katie.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't think God feels the same thing.
That's a good point, yes. Okay, proposition 4, if all squirrels died, then there would be more nuts. Who's still raising hands? Okay. Proposition 5, if Zach says that AI is alive, Julie's going to freely choose to kill Zach. Wow, a lot of you think people are pretty confident with that statement. Okay. And proposition 6, the square circle is in dimension 682. Anybody think that most philosophers agree God knows that? Okay, most of you think no. Interesting. Well, like I said, here's our problem statements from here. Propositions 3, 4, and 5 are going to be a little dicey. We're going to dig more into them. Statements, things that are contingent, or the word freedom. All of this is going to wrap up into what is logically possible to know or not. If God's omniscient, he only needs to know what's logically possible to know. So what statements of these are logically possible to know? That's a lot of our question. Can we merge freedom and future knowledge? So propositions 1 and 2. If you raised your hand for these, you would be correct. Most people believe that God knows everything about the past and everything about what's currently going on or the present. Well done. You have got 2 points. Proposition 3, I will fall asleep at 2 a.m. tonight. This is a statement of future knowledge. It's called foreknowledge, when God has kind of knowledge of these sort of statements. It falls within God's free knowledge, or his knowledge of what will be, what has been, and what is. So free knowledge is kind of God's knowledge of all of the universe, past, present, future. Foreknowledge is God's knowledge specifically of the future aspects. Now, most theistic philosophers would agree that God has this kind of knowledge. But there is a subset, which we will talk about, called openness theology, that would actually deny that God has this kind of knowledge. They still hold God's omniscient, but they would say that this is not a statement that can be known, and therefore God doesn't need to know it. So let's briefly talk about why a lot of people hold that God knows the future. Well, biblical evidence seems to support this. Isaiah 46:10, declaring the end from the beginning, from ancient times, things which have not been done. Daniel 2:28, God made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place. 1 Samuel 23:10, this is a really, or 10 through 13, this is a really interesting one where essentially David is trapped in the city of Keilah, and Saul is coming down to the city to attack him. And David asks God, if Saul comes here, will the men of Keilah give me up? Or will I still be safe and will they protect me? And God says, well, if Saul comes here, they're going to give you up. So David leaves the town. Saul never shows up to it. And we have kind of an interesting situation there, which we'll talk about more later. Acts 2:23, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross. So AKA, God has preordained Jesus to be on the cross in some respect, or he knew that he would be on the cross. And there's so much more we could go into on that. Another reason a lot of people hold that God has foreknowledge is because they understand God as this supreme and perfect being. Arguably, this requires belief in foreknowledge. AKA, if God is the greatest possible being, the greatest being you could think of, and if the future seems to be like something that could be true or false, something that could be known, then God should know that thing. That just seems to make sense philosophically. This kind of falls in if you accept a lot of arguments called ontological arguments. You're probably going to lean toward favoring God as knowing the future. Another reason, it seems like God is sovereign and that he is providential, which means he controls or orchestrates the future. AKA, you pray for something, it seems like God can actually make that happen, or in some ways guide or shape the future, AKA put Jesus on the cross. If God needs to have this ability, it makes a lot more sense if he knows the future. It's really hard to plan and organize events toward your will and toward an outflow if you don't actually know the future or have knowledge of what will happen in the future. Additional knowledge means more power, means God can actually providentially control the world and that he's sovereign. Again, exhaustive knowledge would give God exhaustive power. So it seems like omniscience and omnipotence are tied together. Therefore, God needs to know the future. And finally, a lot of people think that God has foreknowledge because we've thought that for a really long time. A lot of the church's leading thinkers in all of history have held this. So here's a quote from Justin Martyr, probably one of the earliest apologists. In God's foreknowledge, he sees that some will be saved by repentance, some who are perhaps not yet in existence. Augustine, to confess that God exists and at the same time to deny that he has foreknowledge of future things is most manifest folly. You gotta like Augustine. You've also got a lot of medievals who hold this, and a lot of reformers who would hold this as well. So foreknowledge has been around a long time. A lot of people think that God has foreknowledge, but we will talk about some people who deny this. Proposition 4, if all squirrels died, then there would be no more nuts. This is what we call a counterfactual statement. It's relating to or expressing what has not happened or is not the case. There are debates about, more specifically, when God has his counterfactual knowledge. Most believe that generally God has counterfactual knowledge, but it gets more dicey when you talk about counterfactual knowledge of what free creatures do, and where you try to put when God has his counterfactual knowledge. Is it before he creates the world, or is it after he creates the world? We'll talk about that at the very end of the presentation. Now, this kind of falls into a subset of what we'd call God's natural knowledge, meaning his knowledge of what could be, aka possible worlds he could create, or necessary truths, things like 2 + 2 = 4, or you can't be both A and not A in the same time in the same sense. Again, most theologians would hold that God had this knowledge before creation, but some are going to argue that maybe he doesn't have it now because he's made free creatures, and that just destroys his ability to know counterfactuals. That's an interesting one. So here's one of those statements that's a counterfactual, but it's about free creatures. We call this a counterfactual of creaturely freedom, aka CCF. This, if God knows statements like this, we will say that they apply to his middle knowledge, his knowledge of what free choices individuals would make in different possible circumstances. Why is it middle? We will learn that at the very end of the presentation. Can't get ahead. These are all our definitions that we need to know so that we can then understand the different views. So a few more definitions we should know just generally about the field. Compatibilism is the belief that freedom and determinism are compatible. What is determinism, you asked? That's the doctrine that all events, including human actions, are ultimately determined by causes external to the will. So if God made you with a certain disposition and edifice and put you in a certain place, determinists would say you are fated, as it were, to go in that direction or to be in that position. This poor cow here, he's kind of determined to the slaughterhouse. He's dying. So incompatibilists disagree with that. They say that if you view the universe deterministically, meaning that all the things before and behind you have kind of just set you up to go on a course, that's completely at odds with freedom on an incompatibilist view. And a lot of incompatibilists are going to have this idea of this principle of alternative possibilities, which means a person is morally responsible for what they do only if they could have done otherwise or could have somehow influenced the course of events. We'll see a few different arguments from the incompatibilists later as well. So, last proposition. Hopefully you're tracking your score so you can, see how good you did. The square circle is in dimension 682. Everyone agrees that this is silly. God doesn't need to know this, so you guys did really well here because it's illogical. It's nonsense. It can't be known. So again, keep in mind that God can be omniscient without knowing things that are unknowable. So if certain statements are unknowable, we don't need to worry about God's omniscience if they exist, because they have no truth value. My slides aren't advancing. There we go. So that is our background. Everyone okay so far? Awesome. So let's go into the problem that we're going to be discussing tonight. Our first premise, if God foreknows that Adam will sin, then it's necessary Adam will sin. If it's necessary Adam will sin, then Adam will not sin of his own free will. If God foreknows Adam will sin, then Adam will not sin of his own free will. AKA, God's foreknowledge just killed our freedom. We don't be free. I'm forced to say the next words to you. This seems like a problem because we want to hold that God foreknows Adam will sin. That's a pretty big thing. We just talked about that earlier. We also want to hold that Adam will sin of his own free will. Uh-oh, what are we going to do? Can we not touch this? Have we just blown off our entire theology? Hopefully not. We need to reject premise 1, premise 2, or we need to drop these two fundamental beliefs. So let's look at different ways different Christians have responded to this. The first view is called the openness view. They're just going to come out and say it. They're going to reject the fact that God has foreknowledge. They say that God loves us, he desires that we freely choose to reciprocate his love, and he has made his knowledge of and plans for the future conditional upon our actions. AKA, he built freedom into this world, and because of that, he has given up any potential to know the future. He didn't build automatons, he built free creatures, and free creatures nix your ability to know the future because they're incompatibilistically free. That's the openness view, and you can kind of see where they're getting this. Again, the future is not something that can be known because of freedom. Therefore, God doesn't need to know it, but he is still omniscient. He knows everything about the past, everything about the present, and from that, he can predict and guide a lot about the future. Now, you're probably sitting here asking, well, what about all those prophetic texts? What about when he tells kings certain things will happen? The open theists are going to read these a little bit differently. They're going to read them as conditional predictions about what might happen given certain conditions, or forecasts based on his knowledge of the past and his knowledge of the present. So what he says is most likely to happen. He can kind of guide the future in the directions he would like, just based off what he knows in the past and the present. You can kind of think about this like Jonah. Remember when Jonah is supposed to prophesy to Nineveh, they're going to be destroyed, and then Nineveh doesn't get destroyed because they repent. Maybe a kind of an example of a conditional type of prophecy. So there's a lot of reasons people like this view. For one thing, the problem of evil essentially has gone away because God didn't know that evil actions would happen. People freely acted and they chose evil, and that's why there's suffering and darkness and evil in the world. It's not at all on God on this model, which is nice. That's a benefit. They'd also say that this makes sense of scriptural passages where God seems to change his mind, where he seems to regret decisions, speaks of the future conditionally, gets surprised or disappointed, or tests people's hearts. AKA, why does God test Abraham's heart? Because he didn't actually know what Abraham would do until Abraham went and got into the situation. That's their model. But there's a lot of reasons that people do not like the openness position. For one thing, we talked about how historically Christians have almost universally held that God has foreknowledge. It's kind of not cool to go against that much history. On top of that, how does God have providence and governance of the world in this way? It seems really hard for him to actually answer your prayer if freedom and all these other things might be clashing. Like he might know to 87% certainty that a future is going to go this way, but is that really enough to have providence, to really get Christ on the cross, to make sure he pays for your sins and all that? Difficult. What about predictions of future events? They're going to say that this still just it isn't sufficient to explain what we see in Scripture. And then it seems like this view puts a really big responsibility on us and our choice for our own salvation. It doesn't seem like God has graciously guided us into a loving relationship with him, which seems to go against Scripture on a lot of people's perspectives. So that's openness. That's our first view. Good with that? Awesome. So let's look at a different way to attack this problem. We just decided let's nix problem P3. Now, let's look at some of Augustine's views, and he's going to look at rejecting the second premise, or this idea that if it's necessary, Adam will sin, Adam will not sin of his own free will. So Augustine basically took a bunch of arguments for free will, a bunch of arguments for foreknowledge, and he said these arguments together seem to be much stronger than the idea that premise 2 is actually true. So we should just deny premise 2 because it seems really clear we have free will, and it seems really clear God has foreknowledge. Now, of course, Augustine's before this whole argument was formalized or anything, so he's not really attacking it the same way we would in a modern sense. But here's kind of a way he puts his view. Just as your memory of the past doesn't force the past to have happened, so God's foreknowledge doesn't force the future to happen. Just as you remember things you have not done, but didn't do everything you remember, God foreknows everything, but does not cause everything he foreknows. I realize that's a little bit of a mouthful, so simply focus on this fact that Augustine is denying this second premise, and he's kind of inadvertently denying this principle of alternative possibilities. Like, just because the future is set in some way by God's foreknowledge doesn't mean you're not free. That's kind of what Augustine is going for. And we're going to look at different frameworks that kind of merge out of Augustine's thinking in our next two views. So that's Augustine. Let's see what kind of came out of his thinking in more of a modern flesh. So the first view we'll look at is the Calvinist view. A lot of people equate Calvinism with just rejecting the fourth premise, the idea that Adam will sin of his own free will. Calvinists are going to say they're not really doing that. They're working from Augustine's tradition, and they're eroding our confidence in this second premise, or premise 2. What do you guys think when you hear the term Calvinism?
Woohoo!
Tulip? Okay. Any other thoughts? Yep. Okay, so tulip. You're probably thinking it's a collection of doctrines people believe, like total depravity, predestination, limited atonement, God's grace is irresistible, things like that. Well, in truth, that's a pretty broad, unnuanced view of this systematic theology. But I will grant that a lot of these kind of beliefs tend to push a lot of Calvinists into holding some form of theistic fatalism or determinism. They would say, yes, we are determined. But they're going to say, no, that doesn't destroy our free will. I actually want to look at the compatibilists from the perspective of the incompatibilists, so you can kind of see what they're thinking when they look at arguments against determinism. So let's start with a classical argument. If someone acts of their own free will, then they could have done otherwise. If determinism is true, no one can do otherwise than one actually does. Therefore, if determinism is true, no one acts of their own free will. Well, what's implicitly assumed in this argument? Namely, that freedom equals the principle of alternative possibilities, that you have to have an alternative possibility in order to be free. Another argument here, the source argument. A person acts of their own free will only if they are the ultimate source. If determinism is true, no one is the ultimate source of their actions. Therefore, if determinism is true, no one acts of their own free will. Again, implicitly assumed in this is that freedom relates to having some sort of causation, or this ultimate causation to shape and change the future. Finally, let's look at what's called the consequence argument. Assume determinism is true. If determinism is true, no one has power over the facts of the past and the laws of nature. No one has power over the facts of the past and the laws of nature entails every fact of the future. The future is governed essentially by all of the past, how everything's been set out, how God has made you and put you in a certain place, and so on. Therefore, no one has power over facts of the future, aka if no one has power over the facts of the future, they have no power over how the future is going to unfold. They're not free. Again, it's implying that freedom here means you have some sort of ability to change the future outcome of events. The Calvinists are going to say, those are really bad ways to find freedom. Freedom doesn't mean you have the ability to do otherwise. It doesn't mean you don't, or you have to be some sort of a source of your actions, or that you have to change the future. They're going to say that freedom is an agent's ability to do what they wish in the absence of impediments that would otherwise stand in their way. AKA, an agent can find no stop in doing what they have the will, desire, or inclination to do. So again, it all comes down to what freedom actually is. Let's kind of try to flesh out how maybe you wouldn't have an alternative possibility, but you could still be free, with a little thought experiment called the Frankfurt case. There's you, Julie, and Zach. You want a K-word, Zach. Julie wants to K-word, Zach. We're using that term to avoid the YouTube censors so that we can get this through.
You used it earlier.
Did I?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, cool. Well, now you know. In case you hadn't realized what K-word means, K-word means that Zach is obviously predestined to die, and Julie is righteously upset over Zach's AI use. And you don't want to go to jail, because jail sucks. So you want to make sure that Julie is the one who kills Zach, not you. So how are you going to do this? You happen to have this awesome futuristic device that is going to scan Julie's mind, and if it sees Julie's mind start to shift away from killing Zach, it's going to rewrite her mind and make sure she pulls the trigger. If, however, it sees Julie's mind is continuing on a set course to pull the trigger, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to watch. So turns out Julie ends up K-wording Zach without needing her brain rewired. So she had no alternative possibility. This machine was going to ensure that either way she pulled the trigger. But does that mean that Julie's action wasn't free, or that she's not morally responsible for the action? There you go. That's the Frankfurt case. It's a thought experiment in a nutshell, but now maybe you can see where the compatibilists are coming from. Now, against this view, there is kind of a typical response people bring up that say, well, it seems like on this theory, God is morally responsible for everything that happens because he set the events in motion. So isn't the problem of evil a really big problem? On this view, especially? Compatibilists respond in a few ways. The first is that they say God has a pretty unique relation to the universe. It's more like he's the author of a story. Just because he wrote evil people into his story and the evil people did evil things does not mean that he is an evil author, any more than J.R.R. Tolkien's evil because he wrote The Eye of Sauron into his story. God has this unique relation with the world, and the actions of the people he allows in his story are not equatable to his actions or his will, necessarily. Or, as Augustine would put it, nor would a good being permit evil to be done, only that in his omnipotence he can turn evil into good. AKA, maybe God is using evil and the like for his good and for his ultimate fulfillment of the world, but that doesn't mean that we need to be thinking God is evil. He's willingly permitting evil actions, but he's not causing them. Or he can't and will not cause evil, but he will know it'll happen and allow it to pass. So that is Calvinism in a nutshell. Let's look at another solution to this problem. And again, we're going to go from the Augustinian tradition and attack premise 2. The Boethians are going to reject the second premise by essentially trying to explain how God foreknows Adam will sin. So, in philosophy, there are two theories of time. A theory means that only the things that exist on the present slice of space-time are real. B theory means that everything in the past and the present and the future currently exists in like a space loaf. You can think of it that way. They say if we put God outside of time on B theory, then he foreknows things just by seeing them. It's like he's a librarian looking at all the covers of the book. He sees all of the way the story's going to go, and he's outside of time. He's not forcing it to happen by knowing it. He's just outside of the time bubble. There are some problems that people bring up with this view, the main thing being B theory just doesn't work. And it really just depends on philosophically where you wind up on whether or not you choose this view to be plausible, because if B theory works, you probably should take it. But here's some reasons why people don't like B theory. For one, it seems like God's acting in the world. It seems like he's sustaining the world. It seems like he's changing moment to moment. It seems like he's performing different actions at different times, AKA he's acting a lot like a temporal human inside the book. He's not acting like a librarian outside of the book. So maybe God's actually inside the book. That would be one argument. Another argument they say is the problem of evil is really bad now on B theory because everything in the past still exists and the present still exists. That means even if the eschaton arrives and God, comes back, he restores the world, he restores creation, he makes everybody good, all of that evil is still around and it's still happening in terms of its relation to God. So that seems like a bad thing. Maybe we don't want that. That's one argument. Some people just like to say, well, after God fixes everything, he destroys all of it. But then he destroys a part of you, in a sense, because that's actually like a part of you, because you're a creature extended through space-time. And then they say, maybe this doesn't work at all. So let's say God writes something down and he gives it to Moses in the past as a prophecy. Hasn't he just restricted foreknowledge inside the book, as it were? Because we've just regenerated the problem if he's written it down and stuck it back into our space-time blob. Because, of course, God can't write anything false because he's omniscient. So they're going to say that's a problem, and that means that this entire thing doesn't work anyway. So that is the Boethian solution. Now we're going to get into some of our more complex, difficult solutions. So let's look at the alchemists. The alchemists are going to reject this first premise. If God foreknows Adam will sin, then it's necessary Adam will sin. It is necessary is a very philosophically loaded term. It means essentially it can't not be the case. It must be the case. It has to be the case. The alchemists are going to say, really? We're going to make a category. The category is hard fact. A fact that is composed of only truths made necessary by being about the past or the present is a hard fact. Our second category will be a soft fact, a fact comprised of, at least in part, of truths about the future. Here's the thing. Hard facts, they're definitely necessary because they're about things in the past or the present. They can't be otherwise. They can't change. They are the way they are. Soft facts, not so much. They're only really necessary when they actually happen. Until something in the future actually happens, it's not necessary. That's the alchemist view. So, God's prior knowledge of Adam's sin may not become accidentally necessary at the time Adam comes into existence, which undercuts our only reason for thinking that God's foreknowledge is making our freedom fixed and inevitable. We're just destroying premise one. It blows up. So, there is a big objection to Occamism. Namely, okay, let's say that God's foreknowledge isn't a hard fact because his knowledge has some part of like future-ness to it, but his forebelief doesn't. What God believed, yesterday, it's fixed. It's stuck in the past. It has no future component. So it seems like our problem is just back again, right from the start. How do the alchemists fix this? Well, you need to prove that God's forebelief is a soft fact. You need to prove that what God believed yesterday actually has some future component. First strategy is to try to unpack what it means for God to hold a belief about the future. If God's belief is constituted as the belief that Adam will sin only retroactively, once Adam sins, nothing about God's prior belief would be inconsistent with Adam's freedom. I realize that is a mouthful and a very complicated phrase. So if you're more interested in this, look up Thomistic Ochimism, Hilary Putnam's Wide Content to Divine Foreknowledge, or David Hunt's Dispositional Omniscience Scenario. This strategy is complicated, so don't worry too much about it. But let's go into the more complicated one, because that will be more fun. So, another strategy they do is to assume a fact is soft in virtue of how it's related to other facts. You guys ready for the really long argument? JK, it's really complicated. It's not worth our time at the moment, but if you're curious, ask me later. Then their final strategy is to say that God's holding a belief about the future is not a hard fact because it's dependent on the way the future turns out. So Adam doesn't sin because God believes he will sin. God believes he will sin because Adam actually will sin. If Adam were to refrain from sinning, God would have believed that, and there would have been no prior belief from God to dictate Adam's actions. You can think of this kind of like PEMDAS, when you were in elementary school and you had to put your parentheses the right way and do certain math in certain logical steps, or else your entire problem would blow up. The alchemists are just saying the math works out such that Adam's sin or what Adam does in the future goes back in time, but you have to order it logically this way. So fundamentally, where are the alchemists always going to get stuck? Where are they going to struggle? It seems like anything in the past has this unique property of being fixed or necessary and thus unchanging. If you hold this understanding of the past, then it's really hard to claim that God's past beliefs don't have that same kind of necessity, but are somehow exceptions to the rule, or exceptions to how we normally think about things in the past. So the alchemists have to try to justify that within their view. So that's alchemism. That's our second most complicated one. We're going to go to our final solution to this problem for this talk, and it's our most complicated one, so hang in there. You're doing great. Let's look at Molinism. Molinism is going to go back to attacking that second premise, and they're going to try to, again, reject that premise by explaining P3, or how God foreknows Adam will sin. So back in the 16th century, you had a bunch of arguments between Catholics. People agreed that before creation, God had knowledge of what could be, or his natural knowledge. And then after creation, they believed God knew things like counterfactuals, contingent truths about the actual world, what would be, what is, what was, his free knowledge. And the Dominicans especially were really into holding that God knew counterfactuals only after he created. This guy named Louis Molina comes along, and he says, actually God knows counterfactual statements logically prior to creation, or kind of before creation happens. And he calls this God's middle knowledge. So here's kind of how we would phrase it. In the classical view, you have natural knowledge, you have creation, and then you have God's free knowledge, his knowledge of past, present, future of the world he actually made. In Molina's view, God has natural knowledge, aka, all that must be the case, all that could be the case, possible worlds and like. But he also has this thing called middle knowledge, where he knows what free creatures would do in given scenarios were they placed into them. What does that ultimately mean? God's foreknowledge is based on his middle knowledge. Before he created anything, he knew what you would freely do in certain situations, and he put you there. So your freedom is maintained in whichever world he created. You can kind of think of it this way. Here's God before creation. You could make world 1, where Julie freely chooses to kill Zach. World 2, where Julie freely chooses not to kill Zach. World 3, where Julie doesn't exist. And ad infinitum, and he chooses to actualize the world where, of course, Julie kills Zach, because that's more fun. And that world is created.
Said the K word again.
Oh, shoot. It's okay. I'll make it worse later. So all of this comes down to whether or not counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are something that you can know. I need to confess a few things. I have been unfair to Julie throughout this presentation. She's nice, she's sweet, she's kind. Julie would never K-word anyone, not even Zach. Uh-oh, it seems like I know a counterfactual of what a free person would do in a given situation. And it seems like scripture indicates God could know things like this too. David and the men in Kaliah, God told him, what they would do in a given situation that never actually arose. Yay! It's actually not that simple, because this happens after the creative decree, so we can't necessarily extrapolate it to before the creative decree. That's what people are going to argue against on this. But it seems like counterfactual statements of creaturely freedom can be known. The big problem philosophically with this view is what's called the grounding objection. Essentially, how can God know if it's true Julie would freely choose to kill Zach in a given situation if Julie doesn't even exist yet? How can God have his middle knowledge before the creative decree if he hasn't made anything yet? It seems hard to know what Julie would freely do before Julie is. That's the argument that people are going to bring up against this view. And the Molinists have solutions to that. They're going to say, why do we have to assume that a counterfactual of creaturely freedom has to be made true by the existence of a physical object? So why does Julie have to be around before God knows what she would freely do in a given situation? They're going to say there's this theory of the relationship of truth and reality that you're relying on to make the grounding objection. We need to have that actually defended and robustly known before the grounding objection is going to kill our view at all. There are a lot of propositions whose truth makers aren't and don't imply physical objects. So let's look at a few of them. Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's not around yet. He's dead. But this is still true, right? Even though Napoleon is gone on an A theory of time. I suppose he's not on a B theory of time, but let's ignore that for now. How about this proposition? Torturing a child is wrong. Let's say there are currently no children being tortured. I realize I just blew up the entire algorithm on YouTube, but that's okay. If there are no children being tortured, is this statement still true? It seems like it. What about 2 + 2 = 4? Do things have to exist before this is true? Or are the laws of math just true regardless of their existence? A lot of philosophers are going to say it seems much clearer that counterfactuals of freedom are at least possibly true than it is that the truth of propositions must be grounded in this way. That's from Alvin Plantinga. He's a good philosopher, so you should meet him if you can. And you have made it. You have survived the presentation. Well done. Give yourselves a hand. That is the hardest view we will cover. Excellent. So, takeaways. There are a number of ways Christians have gone about reconciling God's freedom and foreknowledge. Your freedom and his foreknowledge. You have a lot of options. I also want to point out that while this has been a broad survey of some of the views, this discussion brings up a lot of different philosophical questions and things. We've talked about theories of time, the problem of evil, theories of freedom, metaphysics, which is the study of what is or what exists, epistemology, the study of what you can know or how you know things. So clearly we have not covered all the ground that needs to be covered. I encourage you to practice intellectual virtues, think, talk, study more to build up your views and to understand what threads pull on other threads when you choose one view over another. If you want to dive deeper, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, take all the definitions and things you have learned, plug them into this, and it will help to give you resources and further avenues to explore. If you're looking for different arguments pro and con between views, 4 Views books are great. I think they also have one on like time. There's a great Four Views book on divine foreknowledge that I used for this presentation. So go to that, it's a good one. And then stay involved with RC, connect with us, scan this giant QR code, and you will be happy, maybe. I don't know the future, so I'm good. Questions? Yes.
So I guess my first question is, are CCFs, right?
Yes, counterfactuals of creaturely freedom.
Bad for the ozone there, right?
It depends on whether or not they're fluorinated.
Okay. Second question is, it seems like even humans can like predict both what other humans will do in the future, as well as you can even lay it out in a counterfactual statement, like if this, then that, if this, then that, and make reasonably accurate predictions about what other people will do if you have enough data. How do open theists respond to that?
I mean, they would agree with you. So they would say, yes, that's essentially what God is doing when he is saying future predictions and prophecies, is he's taking all of his knowledge about the present, everything about you, all he knows about you, everything, all of his knowledge about the past, and he's using that as kind of an input to predict the future. And he could predict it, 99.9%.
Yeah, it seems like
but the problem,
a really small remaining percentage.
yeah, and that's what the open theists are going to say. So again, they're not saying that God is not omniscient. They're just saying the future isn't knowable. And that's how they're couching their whole view. So, I mean, they have a good argument. The difficulty is, one, they don't have any historical support within church tradition, and then two.
I'm still not sure I would say that if you accurately predict, I'm still inclined to call that knowledge, I suppose. But I guess that's the fundamental philosophical difference. Do you call that?
Well, so it's like, okay, if something, I see your point. It's just not, I guess it's not a proposition you can know is true in the same sense you might be able to know something else is true.
Okay.
So like the chair is red, that's pretty much true or false. I will go to bed at 2 a.m. tonight. Can you personally really say that you know that? You might say it's pretty likely given my characteristics and so on, but just how many percentage points do you get before you get knowledge? That's philosophically a difficult question. That's the epistemics coming back in. Other questions? Michael?
Are all of these views inconsistent with each other?
Not entirely. So obviously Boethian, I'm temporarily blanking. There's a few views that come out of Augustine's idea. So Augustinian views is just saying I take the position of Augustine, and obviously there's different ways that works out. You can kind of be a Molinist and also be a Calvinist. There are different Calvinist Molinists. So you can mix and match them. So like William Lane Craig, for example, he's a Molinist who holds A theory. Most Molinists hold B theory. So a lot of Molinists can also kind of be on the Boethian side of God is outside of time, and so that's how it works. So a lot of philosophy is baked into all of these. But no, I wouldn't say you can hold just one. You could hold multiple. Any other questions? Yes?
If I said that the sun will rise tomorrow, would that be a soft or hard fact?
They would say it's a soft fact, I think. That would be my current understanding. Because what happens if the sun blows up? What if some alien being shoots a laser into it and then the sun is gone? Then the sun won't rise tomorrow. It might. I mean, it could be it could be a dark matter laser, the likes of which we have no current scientific conception. It could still lace, I don't know. It could lace with dark matter somehow. Yeah. Julie.
So, in the Creator Decree on Molinism,
Yeah.
how different is God's determined decree different from what a Calvinist would say? That where God had middle knowledge in Molinism at that point and wouldn't have it on Calvinism.
So a lot of Calvinists there are Calvinists who are also Molinists, and they're going to say God had middle knowledge, and they're just going to also hold tulip been everything else in the systematic theology.
Wouldn't agree. I'm talking about the ones that wouldn't agree with Molinism.
Yeah, the ones who,
How does the decree, how does God's control and decree differ? That's what I'm getting at.
it differs in the sense that God doesn't, before he creates the world, know what you would freely choose to do
Right.
in the
So
world.
what is he doing because he knows what you're freely, in other words, what is he providentially doing in Molinism at the decree, knowing that your freedom? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, he's taking into account what your free actions would do and how that's going to change the possible worlds he could create, and then he's creating the possible world that has the free actions in it that would lead to what he desires. Does that make sense?
I think what I'm getting at is on Molinism,
we need
he's actually decreeing all the circumstances because he knows how you're going to react. So providentially, he's not decreeing you, he's decreeing the circumstances, but it's kind of a fine line.
Yes. Because he's using his knowledge of what you'd freely do, but he isn't decreeing you directly, yes.
Right.
Jet.
So, with Molinism, can God create? He creates the free beings, yes.
Mm-hmm.
He creates them in His image, fearfully and wonderfully, presumably, because they believe the Bible, right? So, could God create you in such a way that you would freely do something different than what you do? Like, could He make an alternate version of you?
No. In general, or at least I would currently understand them to say no. Because he's basically created you knowing what you would freely do in the circumstances. You are in those circumstances, so your free action is a given. But had your free action been different, he would have known that before he even created the world. So your free action's still on you from that perspective. He has just allowed the circumstances to happen. And that goes to Michael's point that a lot of these views kind of solutions overlap and intermix in different ways.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm really getting at is, so obviously Molinists say that he controls the circumstances, which to a large effect determine what you will freely choose, because you'll only freely choose X in Y scenario. But how is he sovereign over how does he create individuals and have any sovereignty over what he's creating? Because it sounds like you're basically positing he can create you, and this you that doesn't exist yet will respond in these ways to these stimuli, but because it's you, it can't be any different. So it's like, how is God sovereign over you and who you are? How is he really your creator, making you in his image?
Oh, that's a good point. I haven't thought about that fully. I think Molinists would probably tend to say, or tend to lean to the idea that there is a sense in which you are unique in a way that God hasn't made you a robot, right? So your freedom is a real aspect of you, and so that comes with it. So should he choose to create the possible world in which you do X, Y, it's because he really wanted you, he loved you, he made you in his image and put you into the world. So your freedom is kind of just a part of you from the beginning, and so God might want you or will you to do other things, but he has still chosen to create you even knowing you will do other things, or do things that he does not will.
So is it almost like it almost sounds like he has a list of possibilities of essentially beings he can create, and so he can choose to create you, and you will be in the way that you will be. But if he can't modify, I guess if he can't go outside the mold, how doesn't that restrict God to only create? Doesn't that essentially put us in the same category as God, of we are who we are, and he can make us or not make us, but he doesn't really get to choose who he makes?
He
gets to choose the world he actualizes.
Yeah, I mean, he gets to choose whether or not he actualizes a world in which you exist. So he could have well made a world without Jet Pope in it. Yeah. It would be sad, but you know.
What a sad world.
Also, real quick, I saw another hand over. Okay, did you also have one?
Yes.
Because
So
back, I just don't want to.
basically the idea of that Melina is proposing, which is, I guess, and the way it's novel, is not just that God knows CCFs, but that he also can survey all of those possibilities before creating anything. So he can kind of just run through all of the possibilities, or he knows all true propositions about all the possibilities before creating anything. I think that does raise some, I think a lot of Jet's questions were, like, how does that interact with our identity? Like, is there a Sam in multiple different possibilities, or is it a different person, fundamentally?
Mm-hmm.
That's, and then secondly, does that mean that this is the best of all possible worlds? Like God has optimized, in a sense, over all these possibilities?
It probably would tend to saying that this is the best of all possible worlds. And you are absolutely right to point out that the critical thing in Molinism is not that necessarily that God just has knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, but that he had them before he created the world, logically prior to creating the world. Time came with the world, so I know that can be kind of hard to wrap your head around, like the philosophical, logical layering, but the critical thing is not just that he knows them, but that he knows them before he creates the world. Okay, and sorry, now to get back to you, I just didn't want to leave hands. Did you have more? Jet?
Jet, was my statement accurate to part of what your concern is?
Yeah, my question essentially comes down to, like, part of it is what makes you you, and then it's like, so is there this, like, idea of a jet pope that God can essentially either take it or leave it, and if he takes it, this jet pope is going to be part of the world, but if he chooses not to, then it's just like there's no jet pope because God could not make a jet pope who behaved in the way he wanted the jet pope to behave.
I think that does follow.
I mean, yeah, tentatively, I do think that that follows as well. I haven't thought about that particular aspect that much, so I think that's a good thing to think about.
That would be kind of the definition of what it means to be a free agent
Do I
on
assume?
Molinism view.
Do we need to go?
Can I give
Are we 18 minutes over?
potential split?
Oh, gosh.
So
We're fine.
imagine another possible world where there's an individual named Airplane Pastor. And Airplane Pastor has lived the exact same life as Jet Pope has up to this moment. Are we going to say that Airplane Pastor and Jet Pope are the exact same person? Yeah, that's the question. If you say, no, there is something about me that makes me me, and Jet is Jet and Airplane is Airplane, even though they live the same life, in that situation, you're going to say, no, there is some, what we call, or what John Duns Scott has called a hexaity, which is just a thisness, what it is to be this person, in the same way that you couldn't say that, like, there could be a rock, which is a fish. You know, it's just part of being a rock is not being a fish. And so part of being Jet Pope is not being anyone but Jet Pope. And so if you say, no, they are the same person because everything they've done has been the exact same, then you're probably not going to buy into Molinism. But if you say that people aren't completely interchangeable, then it's a lot harder to reject Molinism. I'm not sure that follows.
We can discuss it later. I need to think about it.
Yeah, I think what this stems from is the tension between, this idea of I'm me, and even if somebody was just like me, they wouldn't be me. But at the same time, if God is the Father of all, and He knits me together in my mother's womb, isn't He sovereign over what makes Jet Pope? And couldn't He? I'm not saying that, like, He could make another being and it'd be Jet Pope, but, like, when He wrote me into existence, had He written me with, I don't know,
3 arms?
yeah, a third arm or something, would not I then have 3 arms and still be Jet Pope? Isn't He more sovereign than my identity?
What if he cut off the arm?
Maybe he did.
Well, I mean, so like obviously all of the hair. Like if I add an extra hair to your head, are you still Jet Pope? So some of the accidental features of yourself probably are not the critical thing to yourself. Like you could lose a leg, and I'm assuming you're still you.
Yeah.
That's an important distinction, but that's all I had to add.
If you K-word Zach, would he still be Zach?
If we K-word Zach, would he still be Zach? I'm going to go with no. I think he's going to become a corpse.
Oh, would he be an item?
Yes.
Talking about objectification.
I think a K-worded Zach is not Zach.
Zach's been awfully quiet.
I wonder what Zach has to say.
So you mentioned with Molinism, sort of the notion that God knows what creatures in their free will do. And you talked about the principle of alternative possibilities and how the Frankfurt case kind of shows that that principle might not work as well as we think. So what are the other ways that Molinists present how would Molinists view free will?
So the answer to that is it's probably pretty complicated because I think different Molinists are going to view it in different ways. So, am I right, Michael?
Some say PAP is real. Most just say sourcehood.
Yeah. So, yeah, we went through. Let's see. Actually, I'll just go back. All
But
the
also
different.
They would generally be incompatibilists. They wouldn't be compatibilists.
Yes, as a general
As a
rule, they would
general
be.
rule.
So yeah, all of these different incompatibilist arguments against compatibilist views, they're also supposing something about kind of what freedom is. So this one's more assuming freedom is like principal alternative possibilities. But in this argument here, they're saying, well, you're free if you're the ultimate source of your actions. So that's kind of what they're saying freedom is. Or freedom means you have this sort of unique causal power to change things in the future, such that I can move this phone to like this position. And it's uniquely moved. Or kind of in this argument's a little bit different, so that's not quite the same. But there's different ways even incompatibilists flesh out what freedom is, and not all of them are PAP. Yes?
It feels like the identity question and the free will question can almost collapse into each other, where Jet Pope is the person who has freely decided to do all the things that Jet Pope has freely decided to do. But if God wanted to make a world where some of those decisions were different, he would just decide to create not Jet Pope. So in that sense, whatever freedom was present under Molinism has seemed to evaporate simply because God can switch these free agents in and out.
He does decide the world he's going to create.
Yeah,
That's what you're saying.
it seems like there could be a
And that's
continuous
the
spectrum.
people in the world too.
Yeah,
right?
and a continuous spectrum of these people, such that you can tweak which person you choose based on how you want them to freely behave. In which case, I don't know if I buy that as freedom.
It's slicing the bologna very thin, as my husband would say.
Molinism is just dressed up determinism.
If you want to get out of determinism,
That's
it's not
all it
getting
is.
you that far.
It's just
but,
fancy.
Yeah, it suits me better, but it's not open theism.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess when you boil down to it, there's not really much difference between God programming someone to act this way or God picking from an infinite number of people who will act this way. You know, it's okay, the same thing then.
Unless there is something that it is to be free, but I don't know.
I mean, it is going to... I'm not sure if I would say infinite number of people, because should I have chosen to wear a different shirt today, am I not me? You know, just because I had certain slightly different life experiences, does that radically change the nature of who it is to be Katie? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure if there was a possible world in which Katie wore a blue shirt, if that would not be Katie. So I think that's...
Possibly discrete rather than continuous.
Yes. Plausibly. So maybe there's a certain number of events at which point the Katie is no longer Katie, but it could be that there in fact is just a Katie in whatever circumstances the Katie's in, it's still the Katie.
Yeah, I think another way I could say the question I guess I'm proposing is in the same way that some people are like, how can God know what a creature that doesn't exist would do in a certain situation? My question is, how does God have to choose, basically take it or leave it about this person if this person doesn't exist yet? And like no part of them exists yet except in the mind of God, and he's handcrafting them. So how is it that he pretty much has to take or leave a jet pope that he is handcrafting? Why can't he make this jet pope different if there is no such thing as a jet pope, and therefore this jet pope would have different counterfactuals?
Yeah, and I think part of that at least is responded to, albeit maybe uncomfortably, with this idea that God can choose from what circumstances to put you in and know what you would do in those circumstances, but he actually doesn't have control over, like, he can't put you in the same circumstances and have you do both yes and no, if that makes sense. So he is confined in the sense that if he puts you into a room, you will either sin or not sin, but he can't put you into the room and choose sin and not sin in the same time and in the same sense. Being the person you are. Like, if you're in that room, you would be the kind of person who would freely do A every time. But he can't make you do B in that room.
Just because God does determine some facts about you, like fact A, B, C, and D, doesn't mean he determines all the facts about you. So.
Michael.
We have about 3 minutes before we get, 2 minutes actually before we get removed from the room. So.
Uh-huh.
I was going to go back to Sam's question.
Well, I think if we have a question from somebody who hasn't asked a question yet.
Well, my question's not very serious, so. Back on Sam's
Scan
question,
QR code.
There can only be a discrete number of humans. Does that
Actually,
mean the actual humans?
I'm going to cut you off, Michael. I want you to talk. I want a serious question.
That's more of a question of just between predeterminism and free will and the debate between the two. If, to some degree, like humans don't have, I guess, control over the desires that they get necessarily, do we have free will beyond that? Like, because we can choose, okay, well, I'm not going to follow that desire, right? So it's freedom, but why am I doing that? Well, because I desire to be saved by Christ, right? So I desire to live like him.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I mean, you have the desire to be safe in a way. So, like, your innate desires, if you can't really control those, and those are put on you either, like, I guess, by God or just by the world and the circumstances around you, like, do we really have free will if we can't control our desires?
So, yeah, the incompatibilists, they're going to say no, because they're going to say freedom is either sourcehood, principle of alternative possibilities, or some various other ways of defining freedom, where you actually aren't just like the product of your desires. The compatibilists are going to say yes, because you're able to follow your desires, aka what you want to do or will do, you are really free. And they're going to say that that's just what freedom is, and that's how it kind of commonly works in the world. So I'm kind of like the compatibilist view with Calvinism in this presentation. Of course, there's Calvinists who aren't compatibilists. But a lot of like atheists or atheistic kind of philosophers too, they're on their materialistic kind of framework, everything before you is preordained and preset up, and you're just following your neurons. But a lot of them are still going to say you're free. They're just going to say you're free in a compatibilist sense, but that's fine. And they have they have decent arguments. They've thought it through. They're not being irrational. There's a lot of compatibilists out there who've thought that way. And so you wouldn't be, to view freedom like that, a lot of people wouldn't have an issue with it. If you're more on the indeterministic side and you really think freedom actually is a sourcehood argument or a principle of alternative possibilities, then yeah, you're going to reject that.